Welcome to Common Ground Discourse. We are your co-hosts. I'm Shane Swor.
God's peace. I'm Brother Kenneth. Today, for our first episode, we're going to spend our time defining what it means to have common ground. We're defining our boundaries, defining our sides. Shane represents the non-theist side, and I, by obvious effect, represent the theist side. But before you can have any real conversation, any real discussion, you always have to define your terms. So we want to spend this time being very clear. What are we representing? What are the background that we bring, our own studies, our own ethos? What is the authority we bring to discuss this, as well as recognize the limits that we have in this? Because neither of us can fully encompass or represent the entirety of our side. So we want to be genuine with what we bring to the table, as well as very upfront with the limits and restrictions that we have in that regard.
Right. And I think I'd like to start by defining, what is a non-theist. And, I'm not putting my own definition on this by any stretch, but I think it really helps to clarify what is commonly misunderstood when someone says atheism. I think many are familiar that atheism is kind of charged with a very negative connotation as being a way to battle the idea of God. And in some respect, it isn't false, but what's important to understand is that atheism, non-theism, someone who practices that, it's not, the goal isn't to disprove every claim that comes out or to, by principle, reject the idea of God. What atheism is, it's you cannot make a claim and expect someone to not ask for evidence. And that's really what atheism is. I'm saying, you made this claim, that's great. Let's make as many claims as we can to learn more about the world, but let's look at the evidence as well. Atheism is just saying we haven't been given enough evidence to really allay our doubts,
Right.
And that's really what it is. I feel, again, Jeopardy got this wrong, and I can't remember the episode, but the answer was to the extent of it was a concerted effort to continuously refute the existence of God. I think any respectable atheist would, upon very convincing evidence, would otherwise reconsider their position as long as it was convincing and that it could be proven. And it's not just an individual that's saying ABC. So I think that kind of clears what non-theism and atheism is. In terms of what I identify as, it's kind of interchangeable. It just depends on what I gauge to be a term that's going to have a little to less shock value. If I'm speaking to somebody who I might otherwise think that atheism is a charged word or term, I would say I'm not religious. I've used that plenty of times, or a non-theist.
Now, when you say non-theist, I think of two different camps, and you've spoken of the atheist part.
Yeah.
Can you represent, or even for the sake of conversation, define the spectrum of atheism to agnosticism? Because from the theist side, we hear both.
Right.
And we have our definitions of the difference, but from your own experience, from your own practice, where do you see the divide?
Yeah, and I think a lot of atheists draw from Richard's book, The God Delusion. He creates this scale to which I think inherently, if you're an atheist, you're also an agnostic, just to a certain degree. The evidence that we have, or what would convince us otherwise, the existence of God or whatever supernatural being you're making a claim for, is minimal. And so we go towards, it's more of a probability. God probably doesn't exist. But what does that probability look like? And the probability in my case is it's great that he doesn't exist. And so I think non-theist, atheist, agnostic, honestly, I think they're all kind of getting towards the same thing. The only difference I would say the term like anti-theist, someone who is completely against theism, and Christopher Hitchens was no exception with that. I think he quite often voiced his position against religion in an unforgiving way, but he was good at it, and he made it very clear where he stood on that position. And that's what I hope to do here. I don't have a belief in God in no form, whether it be Thor or the God of Abraham or whoever. So yeah, I think that would be a clear definition of what atheism and non-theism is. So as I use that, just understand it's kind of coming from the same thing. It's just that through all the conversations that I've had to use them interchangeably. But I hope that kind of clarifies the position.
Well, let me give voice to what I hear from a theist side. We who in church sit here and talk about those atheists and those agnostics. Typically, if you hear the term agnostic or atheist come up in conversation on the theist side, the understanding is that an agnostic is someone who doesn't know if God exists and doesn't really care. That they are ambivalent about it. They have no proof that God exists, but they're not going to go out of their way to say yes or no. They're still in that unknown. It could exist, maybe it couldn't. They're not overly convinced one way or the other. Mm-hmm. And because there's no convincing for one side or the other, they're just not going to deal with it. The atheist side is, I absolutely believe there is no God. Mm-hmm. And typically in the theist camp, that's how it's broken down, that an agnostic just doesn't know and therefore doesn't deal with it. An atheist is certain that there is no God. Do you think it's an oversimplification?
Yeah, I really want to comment on this here because I feel like in an atheist's effort to claim what he believes or lack thereof, doesn't really care to spend time defining what atheist is. Any respectable atheist who has found their way to atheism through reasoning or through an appreciation of science, and it just so happens that there's no room for God in that, they don't define what they mean by they don't believe in God. It's not a proclamation that it doesn't exist. It's exactly what you just said, that we don't care to investigate because it would be a waste of time. It's hard to disprove a negative from our perspective. We would spend as much time looking for evidence for God as we would spend as much time looking for evidence for fairies, as to quote how Dawkins puts it. But it's well put to help paint a picture of where we're coming from. So
understand. Well, from our side, from my side, I suppose, I represent the theist camp, and where you as a non-theist, you've got atheists on one side, agnostics on the other. To oversimplify it, the umbrella for that is very small because you've just got essentially two camps.
Yeah.
For the theist side, it would be exceedingly arrogant to say I represent a theist contrary to a non-theist, because the field that is theism isn't just multiple denominations, it's multiple religions. Right. So when I claim to speak as a theist, I have to recognize what theism is as a language, and that's what it means for theology, as a study of theology, what I bring to that conversation, as well as what it is for orthodoxy, orthopraxy, as well as my own denominational identity.
Yeah.
So in its broadest term, theism is simply that belief in the divine, that there is a God or multiple gods, depending on which religious branch you are. And that the fundamental belief is that while there is a secular physical world, there is a spiritual aspect on top of that. Even within the major religions, we start to diverge very quickly at that point. Within the study of Buddhism, you have those that would not have any belief really in an ultimate God or gods that attracts their attention. But then you have other branches of Buddhism, such as the Tibetan Buddhism, that is inherited a panoply of gods that are still actively a part of that religion.
Mm-hmm.
Within Hinduism, the view of gods and the role of gods within active participation of the world, the development of the world, varies differently, very greatly, from the monotheistic religions or the Abrahamic traditions that we have.
Yeah.
But the commonality is that there is something beyond perception, or at least beyond immediate recognition of this very physical secular world. And that at the point of death, there is something that we still participate in. If it's on the Buddhist side or the Hindu side, then it's the act of reincarnation, whether you are still participating in that or escaping that.
Yeah.
Within the Abrahamic traditions of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, or chronologically speaking, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, there is the afterlife. How that varies between heaven and hell, or just an existence and the divine, that itself is up for argument and conversation within those religions. Within Christianity, you then have your whole view of eschatology, that is to say, the end days, when there is more of an intersection between our field of existence and the divine, godly field that will intersect. Whether it's the second coming or the continual coming, that we make the Messianic age, or the Messianic age comes into it against our will. There is great disagreement on what that will look like. What does the afterlife look like? Is it the metaphorical view, or for some the literal view, of sitting around with angels and continuously lauding God's name? Or is it a space of damnation and torment and pain, a continuation of a physical experience in the afterlife?
Yeah.
So it's terribly diverse, but again, the commonality is that there is something beyond this.
Yeah, yeah, and to kind of go off of that, in terms of what I represent, it's difficult because, atheism and non-theism, it isn't this book that was written and then therefore we follow, the commandments of atheism, right? Rather than looking at it like that, which I feel that's also where some confusion might come from, that atheism is this agenda to disprove and refute God and to eliminate religion. That's not the case. How we have to start thinking about it, and for what it really is. Atheism is a product. It is a product of how you think and how you observe the world. And a lot of it has scientific roots. So, to quote Krauss, we will force our beliefs to conform to the evidence of reality. And science observes the natural world. And there's no space to measure or observe anything beyond that. And we have no reason to think that it exists. Everything that we can explain in the natural world can be explained without anything supernatural intervening. And let me take that back. Not everything. We can't explain everything, but everything that we've come to identify, we can explain without supernatural intervention. So take that into account. And in my studies in neuroscience, only just being fascinated with it, I didn't go to college for that, but being fascinated with that and understanding how we observe and how we proceed with a scientific method, versus my personal reservations with religion, all of that ends up being a product to now I'm an atheist. It's not the other way around. And I feel it's really important to stress that, because that can be another misconception. So what I represent here on the show in atheist terms is just myself. But you might find commonalities with other atheists, but it just might be good for our audience. When you have conversation with atheists and the atheists who are watching, I think they can truly identify that there's no background governing our actions. It's just the product of how we address the world.
Right.
So,
but you bring up a good point, or something that we need to be very clear on in this, and that's our participation in tradition for each of these camps.
Yeah.
That as a non-theist, you didn't become a non-theist in isolation.
Right.
You're not the first non-theist.
Yeah, right.
To define your non-theism and how you've explored your non-theist development has been a participation in all those non-theists and philosophers before.
Right.
And that is the same for the theist side, and perhaps a bit more difficult for the theist side, because ours is a tradition, as I said, multiplicity of religions and then multiplicity of denominations even within the single religion of Christianity, of which I participate, that our language of God, which is theology, is not just how we talk about God, but how we interact, how we study, and how we test our thoughts about God. That it is an active process of reassessing and reevaluating that has gone on for thousands of years. And it is, depending on which denomination has broken off at which point, how their theology has developed in its own course in participation or against the theology of another denomination. What I bring to the table is an extensive research of that. As a master's level theologian, graduating from seminary from Emory, I've at least done my studies on that, and then my undergraduate degree is in comparative religion and world religions. So I bring an understanding of the multiplicity to the table. That being said, even within Christianity, we disagree terribly on our theology.
Yeah.
You have those that are trapped in the medieval period, you have those that are more patristic, those that are reformed. When I went to Emory, I had straight A's except for my one A- in Reformed theology. Because once you hit the 16th century, folks, those of us that are patristic tend to diverge. And I'm still very much an old church, a high church Episcopalian. And that practice and the theology that comes from the practice is divergent from Reformed theology. And that isn't to say that I can't represent Reformed theology. I know my Reformed theology. But it is not what I believe. And as we go through these conversations, for our viewers, we will do our best to recognize when we are speaking from our own experience and when we are having to step outside of that intentionally to speak for another representative of our camp. I cannot, with authenticity, speak as a Presbyterian. I'm not a Presbyterian. I'm not of the Calvinist side. I'm not of the Lutheran side. Even as an Episcopalian, I am not fully of a Wesleyan side. But I understand it enough, and I will do my due diligence in researching that if I am speaking on the nature of good and evil in future episodes, that this is how Methodist scholars look at it, this is how a Baptist scholar would look at it, and this is how a patristic scholar would look at it. But because our theology is so much a process of conversation, then praxis, how do you practice this theology in the world? Then you take that experience back to the table, you rehash your theology, you redefine it, and then you do it again through practice. It's a continual conversation. Right. The fact that real-world praxis develops our language of God, and each denomination has its own practice, then I could never fully speak to that, but I will do my best as a theist to at least give voice to it, even if it is not my own theology.
Right. And I have to say otherwise. For me, I can't speak for anyone, really. Atheist Spectrum, again, because there's no background for it. Everything I say in regards to my point of view that happens to be atheist doesn't mean that I'm speaking for any other atheist. Everything I say is completely my own opinion, and I would think that every other non-theist or atheist watching would agree. There's nothing I can say that would speak for them. They might agree, and a large amount of them might agree, but that doesn't really mean anything. But what I represent for the show is going to be your average citizen who was brought up as a theist and lost faith and is now living the world and just going through life absent religion. So I think that is a good preliminary for defining where we're coming from, what we mean when we say X, and hopefully it doesn't cloud any terminology that we might use. And I think, again, as it develops and we feel like we haven't covered it, we'll be very sure to clarify, like you said. I know I will when I use the word spiritual here and there. I don't really mean it as an inner experience for a part of you that isn't contingent of your biology. It really is just, when I say spiritual, I mean something that will leave you awestruck. Just might get you emotional. That's really the extent of what I would mean spiritual. Anything that, again, that's been used in the atheist community, I think that's been defined by Dawkins as well. When you look up at a starry sky at night and you'll feel awestruck, you can describe it as spiritual. So again, we'll do the best we can so that there's no confusion.
Which I think is a good invitation to our viewers that we recognize the limit of our representation. The reason we're doing this is not to be able to show all of theism and non-theism in conversation. There's no way we could do that.
Yeah.
But what we hope is that we create a space which is not purely unique, but a rarity. That those securely theist and those very securely non-theist can have a space of conversation. And through our experience in conversation, we want to invite you in. So if in the course of our episodes, your experience is different, following the model of civil discourse that we want to establish here, we hope that you'll participate, whether through comments, emails, whatever.
Absolutely. Yeah, and if you're local to the Atlanta area or not, we in future episodes, we do plan on having guests in to which we would then act as a mediator to that. And we'd love to have you on. There's definitely future projects, but we want to get people involved. That's, I think, one of the main goals is get people involved in these conversations more often, keeping that civil act, as you said, as they're engaging in these conversations. But I think this is a good segue to what we've discussed in the past. What we want to kind of speak on is kind of playing devil's advocate, as it were. What are some things about non-theism that you would see could be beneficial to the individual? And in the same coin, what are some things about religion that you think could be non-beneficial for the individual? I'd like you to kind of start that.
Yeah, as I tell my students, being an English teacher, when we do formal debate, if you cannot, before you ever give your counterclaim, you have to be able to give voice to the claim that you're contesting. And if you cannot give voice, adequately explain what the other side is believing or stating, then you do not understand it. If you can't give voice, you don't really get it. And if you don't get it, you don't have a place to counter it yet. Right? Otherwise, you're just spouting your opinion.
Yeah.
And I believe that fully with my students, and I want us to hold ourselves accountable, certainly myself, accountable. So playing devil's advocate is very important, as you said. So what I hear you saying about the non-theist side, and really to clarify what we as theists tend to misrepresent. As I said earlier, from a theist standpoint, we look at agnostics as those who don't yet know, so they're ambivalent. Those that are atheist absolutely don't believe, so they're against it. But what I hear from you is that as a non-theist, it's a continual process of inquiry, that you have yet to be convinced. And because it is such it's a consuming, impossible endeavor to prove that God exists, then you simply land on the side, not simply, but you intentionally land on the side that you do not believe in it. For some, it is to go actively out of your way to continue to disprove it, because there are some atheists or non-theists that their life work is to continuously disprove religion.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with you.
Yeah. But the point of your average non-theist is not to disprove, to go out of their way to continuously disprove religion. It's not an active engagement. It's simply that proof hasn't been offered, substantial enough proof has not been offered. Therefore, it is not worthy of their participation in the theist side. As a theist, I see a benefit to the non-theist side, that it holds theism critically. that it holds it so seriously that if the proof is not there, then it is not worthy of their engagement. And why I say that as a benefit is because on the theist side, we have those that engage in theism as blind faith.
Mm-hmm.
And when we start talking about faith on the theist side, folks, that faith is a very charged word, and I recognize that. Because even when we start talking about faith, whether or not faith is allowed to have doubt,
Mm-hmm.
there are those that say if there is doubt in faith, it's not real faith. But there are others, like Paul Tillich, for instance, which we'll discuss in later episodes. Paul Tillich defines faith with doubt. You cannot have legitimate faith unless there is doubt.
Oh, that's what I would have to agree with that. You know, and the spectrum of atheists or agnostic atheists, people who aren't quite convinced that God doesn't exist, you can still be an atheist. It's just not as great a probability of thinking that he doesn't exist. And if you look on the religious side, I think you're correct. You know, in order to be faithful, I think to some level you have to have some doubt. Otherwise, what is faith without doubt? You know, if we could prove that God existed and could have a conversation with us like we are now, do I have faith in you that I'm talking to you right now? No. And so you wouldn't have that otherwise. But I would have to agree. Obviously, it's a support on my side that being conducting frequent interrogations towards theistic claims holds you accountable, and you've demonstrated this in so many previous conversations that you and I have had. You do your best to take that feedback, and then how do you then continue with your faith? So,
yeah, I mean,
good point.
Yeah, and to our side as theists who are watching, and those theists, I would encourage to begin broadening the conversations with non-theist friends. The reason I get so much from the conversations I've had with you is that when we come to our conversations, there's never the intent that we're going to convert the other.
No.
But by being able to critically look at my side through your eyes, I have to take my side as a theist more seriously. That I have to take it for all of its limits, mm-hmm. and recognize and be honest with those limits. It's easy when you're in a camp of everyone believing the same thing that you tend to pat yourself on the back and you just go on. Mm-hmm. If you're never tried, never pushed in your boundaries, you can never fully understand those boundaries. I have come to know my faith, my language, my experience of God better because of the pushback and the critical analysis that you have provided from your own experience of theism. Mm-hmm. And while it has not destroyed my theism, it has certainly changed it, my theology, if you will. Yeah. It has forced me, and this goes back to our conversation of theology as theists, it goes through praxis and engaging in others that don't necessarily believe the same we do, whether as non-theists or even as Christians with Buddhists and Hindus. Yeah,
and I want to interrupt and kind of make a point here, because at no point did I ever go into a conversation where my goal was to aggressively convince you that what you believed was nonsense. Right. And I feel that is a lesson that I've learned, to then invite more conversations with people who are theists, who are religious. Now, my first years of atheism, I think any one of my friends or acquaintances could tell you that I was a complete jerk. I was unpleasant to be around. And again, I was younger at the time, and so when you're young and you adopt these views, you can be a little arrogant, very arrogant, and proceed in such a way that is demeaning. And I found myself in some cases where if I found out that someone was religious, I didn't take them seriously, and I often just dropped the conversation. And as I matured, I found that again, just being in my own circle of atheists, most of the atheists I know are very kind people, but some are aggressive. Right. But I found in those conversations, you're not really learning anything. Other than if you have your discussions of philosophy and other workings, you're then taking lessons from people who have done the work. But a lot of it ends up being this I mean, I can't think of a better term. It turns into a circle jerk where we just talk and bash about, the theists.
Right.
I didn't get any value out of that. And so engaging in conversations with you, it taught me two things. A, that I was being a jerk in my earlier atheist years, but also there is value in conversations with those who are theistic. And not so much to really gain insight to a supernatural world. That's not it. And I think, when I read books and people start using spiritual narratives and related religious experiences, if I'm going to sit there and depict and decipher everything to be a religious claim on the natural world, and that's not right, and I don't believe it, then I'm missing a lesson that can be taught otherwise. And I think there's value. I mean, because at the end of the day, everything we know is the summation of humankind just getting together and thinking about our existence,
right?
And so there's value there. And I think if I can just talk about one of the disadvantages of what a person might run into if they are an atheist, what they might run into, is that you do build this wall up, this nonsense wall. And as soon as you start hearing nonsense, it can shut out other lessons and other values you could otherwise consume from a religious person that weren't there. And again, you can take it all as metaphorical, but if that's how you got to take it, if there's something to be learned, well, then you walked away with something of value.
Right.
So.
And to speak to the accountability from the theist side, I recognize that from our end, especially in the more conservative fundamentalist branches of the faith, that wall that a non-theist may present or have to construct is a matter of necessity as a defense in the current culture.
Yeah.
That we as theists have not been terribly kind for those that do not believe, because the culture of theism has been for so long in all religions. There even a period in Buddhism where it was fundamentalist. Areas of Buddhism right now that are fundamentalism. Within Islam, Judaism, Christianity, Hinduism, all of them, we have these branches where if you don't believe what we believe, we attack.
Mm-hmm.
And because there has been such a long history of it, it's worthy of a theist apologizing for that, not just to a non-theist, but even a Christian apologizing to those that aren't Christian. We really have been asses at times.
Mm-hmm.
And that defense mechanism that comes up from someone who's beginning to separate from what they originally believe is a defense mechanism that is necessitated not only from their own development, but as a means of protection from the aggression coming from the other side. And that experience is something we're going to be addressing in a later episode on Fowler's Stages of Faith, that it is a almost universal stage, that when you move from where you were to where you're going in your faith and development, there is that period of defense and rebellion. Mm-hmm. But it's important, I think, for those of us on the theist side to be very honest with the fact that part of that defense mechanism that non-theists may have to present is a product of our misbehavior. Mm-hmm. That we have not held ourselves well when we encounter things we don't believe. Not just with non-theists, but even amongst ourselves. Our denominational discord has been fairly ugly.
Yeah.
There's no way around that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I agree with everything that you just said. And to kind of draw a parallel as well, again, this will be in a future episode, but the development aspect of those stages, I mean, you can call them stages of faith, but again, going off my previous point, if you read that book, describing stages of faith, only through the lens of being an atheist that's going to refute any faith claim, you could just as easily take the term faith, throw it out, and put stages of personal value. Just to slap a term on it, because we have values. Non-theists have values, but there's a lesson there to learn. And I found, so the interview that we did for your seminary class, I found that to be one of the most stimulating conversations I've ever been in, to which an opportunity wouldn't have been able to come about had I just rejected having those kind of conversations, which I think atheists are quick to maybe like not engage in that, but I feel more times than not the religious will welcome those conversations. Even in the deep South that we're in, I haven't really sensed a lot of hostility in the modern world, and it may be just because I'm not in the hot spots where that's present, and I understand that. Right. But for the most part, it's not like, in cinema or in media. I think the narrative of Southern religion is, the aggression of the fear of God, and you'll burn if you sin and all that. It's not true. And I think you could agree, even in the rural areas of Georgia, you've got people that are willing to engage in a conversation. Now, if I were to say, so I'm an atheist, talk to me, I don't think that would be the case. But they're open to have a conversation about different concepts. Right. Which just to finish, I think that is an advantage of being a person of faith, is that you can be a little open to having those conversations. And it takes, and again, this is my perspective, but I've noticed it takes a well-developed atheist who has lived as an atheist to then engage in conversations with people of religion. And I think you and I are both very familiar with Sam Harris. He's really gotten more into that as he's developed himself in that arena, which I can certainly appreciate, and I hope to model, because there's something to learn from that, and it kind of supports what we're doing here. Right.
It is, again, continuing our practice of devil's advocate. When I look at the non-theist side, I see the spectrum, just as there's the spectrum in theism. And I can appreciate that Dawkins is not the sole representative of atheism.
He isn't. He's like me.
He's just Harris. Yeah, Harris is a different voice and a different practice and a different experience of that. And that not all atheists are aggressive argumentatives, argumentists, I guess, of the case, and that the point of being a non-theist is not to prove that God does not exist. It's to simply live your life as we try to live our life, according to a set of values and belief and understanding of the world that allows you to function better with those around you. Right. And that the non-theist just doesn't have enough evidence to say that this aspect, this story, this philosophy, myth, ethos, however you want to phrase it, there's just not enough for me to engage it. So I'll find another way to create my value system. But values are still necessary. Right.
Yeah. Well, I think we've done a decent job in trying to define what we mean when we say X, and I think we've done a decent job at providing arguments for one another, and as much as we have time for today. Any final thoughts you have on what we've discussed, or for future projects?
I would think that for our first episode, the big thing to recap is that while we represent two sides, we recognize that. We recognize, more importantly, the limits of those two sides. That we as individuals cannot be all of theism and non-theism. But the point of this program is to be able to foster, encourage, and create a space where disparate views can be discussed. Right. We're lucky enough to be able to draw from our own experience and the years that we've shared in these conversations to now be able to share with others that might not have the opportunity to speak with the other.
Right, but are hopefully looking to do so.
Right.
I think anyone would care to pursue that kind of act. So we hope you've enjoyed the first episode here of Common Ground Discourse. We have links to our other social channels in the description below here if you're watching this on YouTube. Thank you, and we hope that you tune in next time.
God's peace. We'll see you then.